We're talking about small scale and medium scale. We will now talk about maybe even the most difficult scale, which is the large scale. So how we deal with the reuse of urban sites, reuse of landscape, reuse of all the space that we invade with our architecture and with our streets and so on. So large-scale reuse of urban areas, design of urban areas for reuse and of landscape. And I would very much like to welcome Helmut Haberl. I can see you already. Hello, Helmut.
Hello.
Helmut is an associate professor of human ecology at the Institute of Social Ecology of the University of Natural Resources and Applied Life Sciences in Vienna. He will be talking to us about the role of material stock patterns for society's resource use and well-being, and also about social metabolism. And Helmut, before you start, I would like to know one thing. I read that you were awarded in 2018 the Advanced Grant by the European Research Council, ERC. What is the Advanced Grant? I'm very much interested in hearing that, and with that I would like to leave the stage to you. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, Wojciech. Well, an advanced grant is just a very large project. It's an application where you apply for a project, more or less, and the evaluation is half-half based on your scientific merit so far and on the quality of the project. And these projects are really large, so I'm about halfway through this project, and it's a lot of fun, but also a lot of work. Okay, so many thanks for the invitation to speak in this symposium. You will get a pretty different perspective now. I also modified all the slides during the day, so it will be an interesting experience now. So the question is, what do we know about the material stock patterns we as industrial societies create? By the way, I can see you, Wojciech, but I cannot see myself, so I hope this is, I'm still visible, I don't know.
We see, well, I can see a small picture of you and I see your screen.
Okay, so then it's all fine. Okay, so I will start by talking about the climate challenge. I think many of you have alluded to that as well. And this is from the 2018 IPCC report on global warming of 1.5 degrees. And you all know that we have the Paris Agreement and governments have agreed to limit global warming to 2.0 degrees or less if possible. This report shows, well, basically, and perhaps this is not something all of you are familiar with, shows the fact that if we want to go towards 1.5 degree, and it's not much better if we aim for 2 degrees, global greenhouse gas emissions must be reduced to net zero in about 30 years' time from now, globally. The basic message I want to send with this here is if we don't reach net zero CO2 in 2050, we will have to have a large-scale application of technologies that are very controversially discussed. You see this yellow part getting bigger the further we down the road we get with our CO2 reduction targets. And this yellow, it's BECCS, and BECCS means bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration, which is, for good reasons, a very controversial technology. If you look at this very rightmost picture, the amount of BECCS we need in such a scenario needs about a land area that is similar to the global current forest area. Yeah, so we would more or less have to convert all our forests into bioenergy plantations that then would deliver biomass, which we would burn and then sequester the CO2. And there are good reasons why this is very controversial. So I guess we should rather aim for a scenario like P1 or at the P2, but certainly not P4. And my second slide here wants to show that anything looking resembling the past trajectories will not and by far not achieve a low carbon scenario. Most current sustainability strategies rely on promoting a decoupling of GDP, of gross domestic product, from resource use or emissions. And here you see an analysis of what happened in the last 10 years. So we see these numbers show that the leftmost is primary energy, then we have final energy, then we have material resources, so that's what we will talk about in a minute, what we use to build buildings or infrastructures. Then we have CO2 emissions and greenhouse gas emissions. And these numbers mean, for example, if you look at the primary energy picture for the high income countries, an elasticity of 0.5 means that if the economy grows by 1 percentage point, we have 0.5 percentage points more of primary energy. So we have something called relative decoupling. What we need actually is very fast absolute decoupling. So we need about 5% reduction in absolute terms of CO2 emissions per year of the current value to get to the 1.5 degree target, and it's not much less for the 2 degree target. So we need a completely different pattern in the future. Basically it means we have to get rid of fossil fuels, which at the moment deliver about 80% of all primary energy globally. And in Austria, it's about 2/3. So we need climate neutral energy to replace 2/3 to 4/5 of global primary energy supply. And in my view, this means, and this becomes now very relevant for architects, I think, that we cannot afford to build any new structures with lifetimes of more than 8 to 10 years that require any fossil fuel. Not just we have to reduce them, we don't have to have any new demand for fossil fuel by new structures. And existing buildings, infrastructures and machinery need to be refurbished or replaced by zero fossil fuel input options in the next 20 to 30 years. So we have a very, very high demand on changing the way we organize our economies and societies. So, and you also announced that I will be talking about something we call social metabolism, which is an approach that has emerged in the last decades. Actually, it goes back to 100 or even more years. Wojciech, I cannot hear you, so you are talking.
Sorry, I was just
okay.
doing a technical stuff. Don't worry. Sorry.
Okay, everything fine. Basically, it's a scientific approach that looks at the use of societies of physical resources like materials and energy. And I will now talk a little bit about that. So societies use resources like biomass from cropland or from livestock that grazes grazing lands, or wood from forests, or fossil fuels or minerals to build up material structures. And in this picture, you see a factory, you see a road and a lorry driving on the road, and of course houses where people live, which leads to, on the one hand, perhaps some reuse and recycling flows, but on the output side, of course, to emissions and wastes. And I will give you an overview of the global picture. We have done a lot of research at the Institute of Social Ecology, also on national and other levels. Just want to show what happened in the last 100 years, or a little bit more than 100 years globally. So in the left-hand side, you see the composition of extraction of materials by human societies. So it starts at the bottom with food, then we have feed, And this is only fractions, percentage of the total extraction of materials. The total extraction of materials grew about tenfold in this period. So humanity is extracting about 10 times more materials today than in 1900. And the fraction, and that's the important message here for this audience, the extraction of materials that are put on stock, and most of these stocks are buildings and infrastructures, has grown from about 20% to 50%, over 50% of all materials. And humanity has meanwhile accumulated stocks of materials of 1,000 billion tons, which is about the same mass as all plants on the Earth's lands have. So buildings and infrastructures already weigh about as much as all plants on land. And there are, of course, large differences between different regions. And in the rightmost picture, you see industrial countries where the stocks still grow like mad. You see the global average. You see one country that really plays a global role, meanwhile, in these terms, which is China, that has reached almost half the level of the industrial region, and the rest of the world, which is still pretty low in terms of material stocks accumulated per capita throughout time. I have put this slide in because we had a discussion on land take. This is just a scenario we have been involved in doing on urban land expansion that will consume some 2% of current global cropland, but this is cropland that produces about 3 to 4% of all crops globally. So this really plays a big role. And in Austria, we have this discussion about land take of buildings, which is very prominent, and Austria is also a very bad example in these terms. Of course, one thing you can do is you can map these material stocks, and we've done so for Austria and Germany in the last 2 years in my project, and I show some results here. These are unpublished results, so for the public version, please delete these 2 slides, or I will delete them before you put them online. So you really see research in the making, and the pattern is not unexpected. You see the big cities, of course, having the largest material stocks. Perhaps more interesting is the kind of differentiation you can achieve. This is data resulting from remote sensing information and the OpenStreetMap data. And you can, this is Berlin, this is part of Berlin, where you can see that we can distinguish total stocks, but also we can break them down to things like single family houses, which are not very prominent in Berlin, but we of course have many multifamily houses for commercial and industrial buildings. But we also see roads and rails. And on the right-hand side of this picture, you see that buildings are something like 2/3 of these total stocks in Germany, and infrastructures about 1/3. So most material, and there is a minor part that is not mapped. This is like things like cars, or of course the machinery in commercial buildings. This is not mapped, but this is probably some additional metals, but it's not a large part of the total stock of materials accumulated in countries like Germany and Austria. I will share very quickly one scenario analysis that shows why the stock development matters in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. We did some scenarios until 2050, where we at the one hand, we looked at what happens if everything develops like in the past, driven by increases in gross domestic product, so economic growth. And then we looked at 2 scenarios where we looked at some kind of options to get at an equal per capita stocks in different world regions. So one would be to converge at the level the industrial countries had achieved in 1970s, which would mean that the stocks would be reduced in the industrial region to a level of 1970, which was perhaps even allowing a good quality of life for people. Or if we would kind of get to a globally equal pattern by converging at the level the industrial countries have now, which would mean that in the industrial countries, stocks would not continue to grow. So we would have zero stock growth in the industrialized countries. So of course, this is a thought experiment, but it's perhaps interesting to see how it influences material stock development and greenhouse gas emissions. So the leftmost part is what happens with material stocks if we follow the GDP-driven pattern. This is more or less the IPCC middle of the road scenario. And you see that, of course, the developing countries where about 2/3 of the world population live will have a small share in the global stocks. Industrialized countries will still grow. China will also grow. The convergence in 1970, even China would have to contract, the industrialized countries would contract, and the rest of the world would catch up. And the scenario D, you see convergence at the 2015 level, and you see this is kind of proportional to the expected population growth. And you see the difference it makes in terms of regional distribution of material stocks. And here you see what it would mean in terms of CO2 emissions without additional decarbonization. So we could also talk about what it means for decarbonization requirements to remain in the 1.5 or 2.0 emission space. I have removed it for time reasons, but you can imagine how it looks like. Of course, it plays a big role which of these scenarios will materialize for our options to reach 1.5 or 2 degree scenario as agreed in Paris. There was a lot of discussion about,
Sorry, may I just check with you 3 more minutes? Is that okay for you?
Yeah, it should probably be roughly okay, perhaps 4.
Roughly good.
I will also show you some patterns on the global circular economy, because we had a big discussion on circular economy. And actually what we see is when we move, this is the picture in the year 1900, this is the picture in 2015, and we see that the circularity of the global economy has decreased, not increased. And in addition, the big picture here is that we have such a big growth in material stocks. Remember, they increased by a factor of 27, that even closing the loop would not reduce the demand for virgin materials very much. That's perhaps an important take-home message. Why are these material stocks important? Well, I think this should be more familiar to architects. Of course, they transform resources into services like shelter, nutrition, mobility. You have seen here now in my presentation, building up and maintaining these stocks requires large amount of resources. I hope to have shown this in a little bit of detail. But also very importantly, they shape social practices, including production and consumption. For example, they shape mobility patterns. So the kind of mobility infrastructures you have shapes mobility patterns. Of course, they play a big role for future greenhouse gas emissions for these 2 reasons. First, you need a lot of resources to build them, but once you have built them, they will need more resources in the future. So my getting towards the end. So in my view, if we want to achieve climate targets, we have to build a completely different pattern in terms of the material stocks flows and the services or well-being contributions we want from them. And some good news here as well. it seems that if we look at non-monetary indicators of social well-being, for example, the social progress index, there can be such a thing as enough. If you look at GDP, there cannot be such a thing as enough, but if you look at non-monetary well-being indicators, there seems to be something like enough. So, for example, people can have a very good level of social progress with only 50 tons of concrete per capita, although countries like Germany like to have 250 tons of concrete per capita, and Austria as well. And the same also holds for primary energy supply. So there are ways of organizing society in a manner that needs a lot less material flows and stocks, but these are not the patterns that will emerge by themselves or through raising efficiency. So we have to understand what we really need, what services we really want and need from social metabolism. So the take-home messages are construction of buildings and infrastructures requires a major and increasing part of the physical resources used by societies. The dissipative use of resources like energy is very much shaped by the quality, quantity, and spatial patterns of the material stocks. So this is appealing to people's will to not use their cars if we have an infrastructure dominated by motorways will not work. It has not worked in the last 30 years and it will not work in the next 30 years. You need a different infrastructures if you want to persuade people to change their mobility patterns. As long as material stocks maintained by societies grow, full circularity is theoretically impossible because you always need virgin material to add to the stocks you already have. So, and even if net additions to stock were zero and the level of stocks were constant, full circularity would still be thermodynamically impossible because you always have some downcycling. And we had many lectures in the symposium that, of course, there are limits to recycling. So basically, I think we need alternative development models where good life requires much lower material stocks, fewer buildings, different patterns of infrastructures that are consistent with the goals. For example, in Austria, the Austrian government has committed to the goal of making Austria climate neutral in only 20 years. And I'm very curious to see how this will happen. Okay. Many thanks for your patience, and I know it's late, so I will stop here.
Thank you, Helmut. And now at the end, we'll see some advertising to
Sure, I have to do that.
Let's just mention it if you show it. Thank you. Thanks a lot. We would like to continue with Sergio Porta. So Sergio Porta, if I may introduce him to you, he's professor of urban design and director of the Urban Design Studies Unit at University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, and academic director of Building Beauty. I like the word building beauty. Please tell us also what this is. And his research is on master planning for adaptive resilient cities. And just this year, very recently, he published a book by Reba, Master Planning for Change, Designing the Resilient City. Sergio, you will be talking to us about change in the realm of urban form and designing and coding the adaptive city. And I like the title of your lecture, which is A Tale of Beauty. Go ahead.
Wojciech, and thank you everybody for being here. It's late. I try to make it as interesting as possible. And I thought I normally play the role of the radical here, but after listening to Helmut, I feel a bit embarrassed because Helmut has brought in a marvelous presentation, I have to say, such a compelling case for probably revolutionizing the world altogether and turning it upside down. Now, how to do that? This is a big question. Okay, let's go back to beauty. Cities and change in the realm of urban form. observe an adaptive city, you see here more or less what I'm trying to, the breakdown of what I'm trying to talk about now, which probably would take about a couple of days. We have 20 minutes, so I'm going to pick up a few things, and I hope something will remain with you. That certainly the presentation itself will remain with you, will be accessible, and it is fully annotated, so you will be able to follow up the narrative step by step, slide by slide. Now, I'm an urban designer, and urban design has to do with the form of cities, material stock, as we have been learned today to call it. Also, it has to do with designing the form of cities, but cities change in time. They physically change, so the question is, how can we design something that continuously changes? And this question has always been kind of overlooked, I have to say, in the history of planning, until relatively recently, when it was addressed mainly as a challenge. If plans have to do with predicting the future, this is a challenge. The future turns out to be largely unpredictable. From large modeling to argumentative and strategic planning, and also consensus building or other interactive methods of planning cities, planners and designers have tried to cope with the unpredictable nature of the future by sourcing more new and different information, as well as by less and less designing the physical form of cities. However, if we value adaptability and change, rather than perceiving it as a challenge, we value it as a genius of good cities, and we happen to be designers, the question stands unanswered. How can we design for change rather than against it? So let's start now from a series of images, which I would like to ask you to watch, sort of trying to direct your mental look into yourself for the moment. It won't last long, just a few seconds. And ask yourself the question, what do these places have in common? So if you are ready, we can start. And again, so normally what I do at this point, I open up an interaction with the audience, which I can't do today because of limits of time. So I will jump to the conclusions if you like. One thing these places have in common is beauty. There is overwhelming agreement, which I've tested in years and years of this exercise, and others of the same like, that these places which are portrayed here in these images have something in common, a quality. For example, these are places in which everybody would feel they could live well. They convey a sense of prosperity. There is economy there. There are projects that we can kind of see. There are opportunities. And you don't see anybody really, except in one of those images, but you see people here in terms of the signs that they live in the environment, the signs of care, the signs of love. These are places in which you can be yourself. These are all things that have been returned to me after engaging with the audience. I don't know if you agree with that, but this is definitely what I found. So in all evidence, all these places, which are ordinary and normal, by the way, they're not special places by any means. This one is in London, for example, nevertheless share this quality. And this is how cities look like when they work well for people, businesses, small, medium organizations, and passers-by at the same time. This is critical, not just for the one category, not just for one particular use, but for all of them. It is so difficult to define this quality that in order to name it, Chris Alexander called it QUON, which stands for quality without a name, which is a good way to name something, no? Quality without a name. But later on in his writing, in his work, he came to call this beauty, hence the title of my presentation, or life, or wholeness, which he derived from David Bohm. This quality, in the end, is our ultimate goal, isn't it? In the end, this is what we want in cities. But all these images also share another interesting characteristic. They are all kind of old places which have not been designed by anyone. Not all together, at least. They show parts, maybe, that may have been designed, but quite clearly the whole hasn't. So here is an uncomfortable truth for all of us, especially if you are designers. The quality that works for people and businesses, the quality that gets better and better with time and makes cities human, well, it does not come by design, I'm afraid. It comes by a process of unfolding in time. And if we want to understand how to generate the quality, we need to understand better that process of unfolding in time, starting from giving it its real name, and this name is evolution. Now, I'm not going to make it too long on this, because we have been talking of evolution already today. But one problem that evolution poses all the times is that it just doesn't fit in a slide. It doesn't fit in one slide, at least, because the sheer magnitude of it is just out of reach to our senses and to our mind. So here I try to express it visually using 2 slides. And long story short, look how thin our evolution as a species is, which is this very, very, very thin red line here. As a species, as a general, actually, not as a species, we started very, very, very late in the process of evolution of the cosmos, of the universe. So that if the evolution of the cosmos was 1 day long, 24 hours, we would have appeared 13.2 seconds before the end of the day, before midnight. Not only that, but if we look into our own evolution as a species, Homo habilis, and if we zoom into that and we make it 1 day long, 24 hours, our cultural evolution, and by that I mean symbols, language, lithic technology, agriculture, the thought of God, all of that, not conferences or talks necessarily, but the way we are, the way we think, the way we see ourselves, all that is culture, and the way we interact with our environment, all that would have appeared 2.3 seconds before the end of the day. And this is invisible, in fact, but it is right here. Now, let's take that invisible thin thing, which is the human cultural evolution, and make it this blue bar here, okay? If that thing was 24 hours long, we would have appeared, cities would have appeared 3 hours, roughly 3 hours before the end of the day. So a bit late for dinner, so to speak. These are cities, which are a cultural product. And if the urban evolution, so if these last 3 hours were 24 hours long, we as planners, or city planning as a discipline, as a professional discipline, as we know it today, would have appeared 22 minutes and 9 seconds before the end of the day. So I guess what I'm trying to, the point I'm trying to make here is that cities have been out there for a long, long, long time before planners came to stage, and judging from those beautiful images we saw before, it is difficult to argue and to defend the idea that the advent of planners was a good idea in the first place. Not only none of those beautiful places was comprehensively designed, but all but one of them were old places, and places which were pre-modern in a sense, and also, and most importantly, pre-planning places. So when we talk of planning or designing cities, one thing is above all important to understand, that these things that the advanced planning systems we know about, including ours, those we can see in the UK, where I come from, or United States, or all over Europe, have historically failed to understand cities and generate sustainable, livable, and prosperous, and equal or equitable cities. So when it comes to planning and design, the quality that works for people, etc., well, we basically don't know how to deal with that problem. But at least we can learn from experience, which is a polite way to say that at least we know how not to plan cities, not the way we have done so far. So never, like in this moment, we as urban designers are called to give a critical contribution to saving our planet and our species. And yet, after a couple of centuries of hard work, often brought forward with the best intentions, the reality is that we can only answer, sorry, it is embarrassing, but we actually don't know. And when it comes to the adaptive, resilient, sustainable city, the problem today is still a matter of exploration. It is still about opening a new way and learning how to deal with the matter. There is an evolutionary approach to the design of cities, and there is a creationist approach to the design of city. The difference is this thing that happens to be here, this box here. Technically speaking, evolution is the core presence of unity and diversity. And the trend, the tendency we have all the time, especially as designers, is to jump that and go back to the creation of beauty, just to the end product of it, and skip the understanding of this thing, which stands right in the middle. We have tried to give a basis of evidence to understanding how can we contribute to the structure or the trellis, if you like, of space of our cities in a way that then would allow and support self-organization to grow, like a climbing plant on the structure of the trellis. So the unity and diversity would coexist at this point, and the dichotomy between design and change would actually be reconciled in this manner. So we did that by looking at cities. This is an old research. I would just skip to the result of it. This was published in 2014, so nearly in the Mesozoic. And anyway, so these are case studies. We just were measuring here at what distance Main Street cross each other. Main Street, not all streets. And as you can see, what we witness is a gigantic leap in scale, which happened just after the Second World War, basically. And what is interesting is that these last bin here, which are informal settlements, which are 20th centuries, are after post-Second World War, yet they go back to the same patterns we can see in pre-modern cities. And one of the differences here, there are many differences, wealth, etc., and so many social differences. But one difference is that there are no planners here. There's no planning system involved, or the planning system is very, very weak in informal settlements by definition. So we see maybe there's something here for planners to think about. Same we did at a larger scale, coming up with an understanding that actually we can measure cities in ways, and we can measure not cities actually, but urban form in particular, in a way which is validated, and actually is validated against the historical origins of the areas that we are analyzing. This is another older research a few years ago, but for the first time we were trying to merge together and connect together urban forms or urban form types, depending on their similarity. You can see here, this is a dendrogram, so-called, and you can see more similar urban types being connected at an earlier stage. And if you progress, the more you progress towards this line, the less similar are the urban types that you merge. Now we get back to this kind of thing. One thing that we found quite clearly and quite evident and quite consistently is this remarkable difference between pre and post Second World War urban form. The hiatus here, which as a matter of a joke maybe, we started calling the first bifurcation in urban evolution. Now, looking at the form of cities and seeking the similarities between them rather than the differences, around which the identity of cities actually emerge by self-organization and by the social work and in time. Looking at similarities, we actually recognized a few patterns, 7 in particular spatial patterns. And most importantly, there's a sort of compound image of how those 7 spatial patterns would look like when they would be put together. And actually, it seems pretty much traditional, to be honest. And even more so if we jump from a scheme to an actual master plan. This is the work of our students. This master plan for the center of Glasgow actually embeds those 7 principles all together. And as we can see, it is far less mechanical at this point and it looks more familiar, doesn't it? But there are also 2 most important non-spatial patterns that we had recursively found in cities which have, demonstrated adaptability through time, etc. And these have to do with control and with the independent development of plots. So these are eminently political matters. Now, these patterns are not embedded, for example, in this design, and this is actually the design that won the last year's WAF prize in Amsterdam, which is the World Architectural Forum, second prize actually for master planning. So this was in the category of master plan. This is Herzog and Moroni. So we are not talking about things, we're talking about things that look trivial in a way and should be taken for granted, but they are actually not the winning kind of approach to urban design that people are witnessing today. And quite on the contrary, the opposite kind of culture regarding urban design is prevailing and continues to be prevailing without any interruption or sensitivity, if you like, to adaptivity, etc. Okay, so this brings us to one realization, that urban form systems, pretty much like natural systems, social systems, economical systems, and urban ecosystems, so natural systems in cities, also the spatial reality, tangible reality of cities is a complex adaptive system. And this is a new thing, because even in the most recent literature in urban resilience, what is considered, what the focus of the attention is not the physical dimension of cities, it is whatever happens on the ground of the physical layer, if you like. Natural system, social system, etc., economical system, but nobody focuses on the way the physical reality of cities change, and actually it does. It changes all the time. And once we realize that, and we also realize that if we look at the same time on one side to system ecology and the models of the way complex adaptive systems change, and we also look at urban morphology, which is the branch of urban studies that looks at urban form change, well, we see that there are conceptually, both areas of science have developed exactly the same concept in complete independency from each other, without talking to each other. But there is a lot of common ground between the 2 areas of research.
Sergio, sorry for interrupting. We still have 40 minutes to go for the conference, and we still have a lecture and a panel discussion.
Okay, I'm sorry for having taken too long. I would leave this presentation for you, and thank you very much.
That's very kind of you. Thank you. I'm very sorry for interrupting. I would have loved to see that, but it's great to have this lecture and to see this presentation. So thank you for your offer.
Thank you.
All the questions that will arouse, I will ask you in 20 minutes. Now we'll be coming to the last impulse statement today, which is Paola Viganò. Paola Viganò is architect and urban designer based in Milan and Brussels. She also does landscape projects, and today she will be talking to us as professor of urbanism at the IUAV in Venice and professor in urban theory and urban designer also at the EPFL Lausanne, where we already had an impulse today. Paola, you're also leading the Laboratory of Urbanism and Interdisciplinary Habitat Research Center, and we're very much looking forward to your lecture about the city as a renewable resource. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much. So I heard today really very interesting things, and I'm very glad to bring, let's say, contribution to this conversation, where what is interesting is that there are still, let's say, controversial aspects. So take this presentation as as a way to bring on a collective discussion also the difficulties of what we are going through. The city territory as a renewable resource has been a kind of a hypothesis on which I've been working since many years now, maybe 10, 15 years, that started with certain metaphorical elements, using metaphors in order to address certain things that seem to be very complicated and difficult to get. And for example, in the case of Antwerp, we use this idea of porosity that is coming from Benjamin, looking at Naples, in the idea of valorizing all these empty spaces, abandoned also spaces. The city, I'm talking here of the beginning, 2003 more or less, when the city of Antwerp was in a very, it was declining very, very much, and there was abandon in the city center, especially in the densest part of the city. And by referring to this emptiness as an incredible challenge for the city to rethink itself, both at the scale of the small empty spaces, but also the scale of the big industrial or harbor areas that had been abandoned. That was a kind of a starting reflection that was at the same time asking for very detailed understanding of the tissues. And I will insist on this point in several moments, but it's clear that the first, I think, fundamental change in our habits concerns our gaze. We have to learn to look at things again. We need to go back to the understanding in detail of the city, not just some patterns, not just some, say, mappings, but really understanding the detail of the inertia, for example, of space, the way in which in the past mixed use were considered possible inside the city, and how today this seems to be so difficult to obtain, and how small projects of reuse were already ongoing, showing an incredible imagination. These are some very big models we realized starting from existing small projects that a younger generation was realizing in Antwerp. And this led to introducing into the structural plan for the city of Antwerp some reflections about the porosity of the different materials, the different urban materials, including in a taxonomy of tissues that had a different capacity or different possibilities to be rethought, and different flexibility also. Let's say the modern buildings different from the ancient city center, all the garden cities with their generosity of green spaces. Every different issue was becoming, let's say, subject of a different interpretation of this possibility to go on, to be rethought, to be reused, etc. We continued with this reflection in the Great Paris, where again the porous city was a fundamental, let's say, instrument to read through this the complexity of the big Parisian agglomeration. And I just want to remember one of the strategies we proposed that was again related to the idea of looking at what was existing as a fundamental spatial capital, both the big cité, the big social housing estate, but also the incredible amount of single-family houses. You cannot imagine how many single-family houses are in Paris. You imagine Paris as being the most very highly concentrated city. In fact, it is really made of this continuous layer of single-family houses with their capacity of evolution. And in this occasion, we proposed a scenario that was the 100% recycle. Now, excuse me for the non-precise use of the term recycle, because of course, in fact, we here is what is meant is more reuse and reconditioning. So here we are imagining to reuse, so give a new interpretation of something that is already there, and eventually to recondition and say adding small elements or reconfigure, but maintaining the object there. So we are not really into the recycling in the sense of disassembling and reassembling materials. But it was an easy term to use. For example, how to revise completely the activity areas that are placed in situations where today industries is not there anymore, or that new activities are needed in order to have them working. So let's say reimagining completely all the different patterns and the different issues of the city. And then from that moment, we studied also through a research. Here we are in 2013 for the Ministry of Culture in France about energy, and we proposed to work on energy and recycling again. Let's say, where we compared two territories: the Parisian one, the Great Paris one, and the diffuse city of the Veneto region. So let's say the metropolitan area around Venice. Let's say the diffuse city and the compact city, two different models, two different territories, two different relations between economy and society, so two different contexts. And we work on these categories, the energy consumption. We work with engineers, energy engineers, but they are very qualitative maps. And don't imagine that there is really big calculation. We had not the possibility to make it more than that. But nevertheless, even if they are qualitative, they are very interesting. They show the energy consumption in the two territories, the embodied energy. So we wanted to evaluate, even if qualitatively, the embodied energy that was into the territory, the energy that could be reused or recycled, and the potential production of renewable energy in the two territories. The scope was not to demonstrate that one was better than the other, the compact or vice versa, the diffuse, but was to show that, in fact, you have to treat those configurations in different ways, and that nevertheless, also the diffuse city had a lot of positive elements. For example, in the possibility of generating decentralized energy, of connecting, because the diffuse city is extremely mixed use, connecting work and let's say industrial work, agriculture work, and housing. So just to show that, in fact, the two forms, they were to be understood. Both, there was not the good one and the bad one on the other side. They were interesting to be understood more in detail, starting from the energy perspective. But the main point for me is that I thought that there were missing theories. We had no theory. I mean, when I use the term theories, it's not in the sense of the rigid scaffolding. I'm saying something that is helping us to structure a certain discourse or a certain approach, a certain research. And then when it's used, I mean, you can throw this structure away. It's not fundamental. But we need theories, I think, in order to reframe our situation. And so they need to construct a specific concept and theories that I started, let's say, in a kind of very simple way, by reflecting on the fact that when we speak about recycling, apart from the definition that I have heard about today, that of course I was familiar with, but there is also in a more, let's say, semantic way, the fact that recycling is speaking about cycling, cycles, life cycles. So for me, this was a fundamental point, to look at the city through this lens of life cycles. Also, the embodied energy at the territorial and urban level for me were crucial. And of course, the question of inclusion, because each time you open or you close life cycles, there are big adaptations that society has to take. And of course, there are people that remain outside and new, let's say, people entering into the arena. So the question of inclusion, exclusion is absolutely central. So these were the first ways in which I thought we could reflect on elements for a theory of the city as a renewable resource, which could be, in fact, has been a research and a design program. I go very quick here. So life cycles, embodied energy at the scale of the territory, and the question of inclusion. The goals, of course, were several and integrated: to reduce the consumptions, to integrate the renewable energy production, to recycle energy. But I wanted to really state and to add this point, valorizing the embodied energy that is already there. And of course, to use, to make a transformation that are not asking for big amounts of embodied energy. And this was, let's say, giving a little more sense to this scenario of 100% recycle, which is even difficult to imagine. In fact, I think the discussion of today was showing that even to imagine this 100% recycled scenario is difficult. We don't have really the imagination, probably. In any case, I think that for this, as I'm repeating what I said at the beginning, is fundamental the description and the observation of what is already there. So you need really a lot of field work. You have to be on site and describe, especially when you do at the scale, not of one building, but the scale of a piece of a territory. Here you see a piece of the diffuse city, and also to understand that the degree of vacancy, that is, we discovered an incredible ambiguous problem. What is vacant? What is really vacant? What is simply underused? What is simply put there, and maybe in the next years we will do something with it. What does it mean exactly, vacant? That's, I think, a very interesting point. And also, how can we use better the existing, for example, sealed surfaces, where we have parking spaces, a lot of space for cars. So here we enter into another fundamental topic, that is the changes in the mobility, the changes in the behavior. How do you use space? And of course, for us, also all the large asphalt areas are incredible resources where you can imagine to transform or to add what is still needed. Okay, very quickly, some images of all these type of interventions and a series of workshops with students with this theme of recycling the city. But now I would like to start to go to something very recent. This is a last work, last vision, let's say, for the metropolitan area on which I've been working. And in this case, we are in Geneva, and I made this research, with this design research, with the Habitat Research Center that, as you already said, is a kind of new 3 years old research center, interdisciplinary, with design at the core, where the idea is that design can put together the different disciplines, and everybody is engaged in imagining what could be the future of a certain territory. As you can see, for example, Corentin Fivet is also part of the team, and many other. For example, I would like to underline the presence of Walter Steil. Walter Steil is now today an old person, but still extremely fascinating. He is the founder of the Product Life Institute, and since the 70s is writing about a longer life cycle for products and decentralization of production. The Transborder Atlas, here we are between France and Switzerland, of the transition. So how can we read the territory through the question of the transition? Which kind of mapping are fundamental? Scenarios of the transition, and prototypes. The prototypes of the transition, this is something important, I think, are not just spatial prototypes, they are ecological, they are social and spatial prototypes. So they have to touch, say, the three dimensions. Okay, I will not stay long here, but we simply reflect also on the last period of the coronavirus and the fact that half of the Swiss people were working from remote. So this is a major revolution. 50% of the population in Switzerland was working from remote. And this is changing completely the way in which we look at the territory. Together, of course, with climate change, that climate change is particularly heavy around the Lehmann Lake. So here you see what we call the Lehmann Alpine metropolis. All the rest here are very, very big mountains, as you know. And of course, the effect of the heat waves will be particularly important in the city, in the densest part of the city. That's something to be, so where the major part of the public spaces are. And the vision. So the vision starting from this territory in which each part has a specific character, in which each part has a specific, let's say, relation between economies and capitals, different type of economies, different types of capitals. Where, here, sorry, I stay a moment, where you see in the diagram on the right, that black and gray are cities and peripheries. Blue and yellow are, say, this scattered structure, long-term structure of villages. And what we see in the last period is that, notwithstanding all the planning system that is trying to compact city and make, let's say, continuities, urban continuities, in fact, the territory is growing in these villages story scattered, which are on the slopes of the mountains along the lake. This is something is fundamental. We have to work on this structure. This is a long-term structure, and we have to work on this structure. We cannot simply impose a model on a territory. We have to work with the territory. And there is a lot to re-understand. Just look at what was the mesh of the public transport 1 century ago, how it became fragmented, and how we should reinvest. Of course, I would like to know from the people that are working on embodied energy, if you think that to restructure this type of infrastructure that are asking, of course, for let's say, energy, do you think this is reasonable? But from our perspective, this is reasonable. There are the traces of the old infrastructures. Sometimes you have pieces. Sometimes you just have a missing piece. You have to reuse. Okay, agriculture, metropolitan agriculture. We did an incredible work on the qualities and the characteristics of the soils, where the fundamental, let's say, things I would like to add is that all soils are important for the circularity and for the transition. All soils. And you can work on those soils, regenerating, reopening, desealing, but also cultivating them, and also reusing them to eventually add what is needed. So the urban soils that normally pedologists are not even looking at them, only recently they start to look at the urban soils. In the case of the canton of Geneva, they are the 30% of the canton, which means that they are a fundamental part on which you have to work. This is a research made by Corentin Fuvet about the concentration of carbon footprint, and where you see that is exactly the periphery, the place where you can really work on this concentration of carbon footprint, higher, much higher than even the central part of the city. So there is a kind of resource there that has to be reused as much as possible. And then, of course, you go towards the transition with a series of actions that I will not have the time to show you, taking really the ambitions of the Green Deal from the European Union as well as from the Swiss Confederation. And then you say, along the time, you will decrease if certain actions will be made. The actions we propose are actions that are dealing with the centrality of public transport. So what I explained.
Paola, may I just ask you in a very, very charming way to come to a conclusion?
Yes, yes. Okay, I'll just show you some pictures to show. This is the reflection on the weak structure. Maybe we can reflect afterwards on that. And then the reworking of starting from the space of industry, putting together the question of industry with the new infrastructure, or say the old infrastructure that are renewed, and the hypothesis of reworking on the existing structures and buildings and infrastructures inside an incredible landscape. in the different parts that have different characteristics. So, okay, I'm not commenting, just passing through, because I think that can really give an idea of what it would look like. This is, for example, very interesting, a district of production, the bar turning production, so metal workshops, that will probably have problems in the next future because they are working with the car industry of the Geneva region. Here we are in France. And we think that, for example, the hypotheses made by Walter Steil in the 70s are still very relevant. So longer life products, reconditioning. So all this mechanical work can be rethought in terms of circular, let's say, economy, and becoming kind of big workshop for the entire Grand Genève.
Beautiful images that you have got.
Okay, but also, for example, to rethink a very marginal area, where nevertheless there is a high-speed train that is stopping there. That is a small French city just on the other side of the border, and to reuse all the city as a new research center for the two countries, France and Switzerland, between Lyon and Geneva, as a using, let's say, this centrality of the place for the public transport or from the TGV, and then connecting with the new line I already showed you very quickly that we are considering to reopen along the Jura, let's say, side, with a lot of synergies that one can imagine, new economies, etc. So from soil and labor, let's say, the idea to work on this circular economy and also decentralized living soils and not dead soils, including the urban soils, the embodied energy and reuse and decarbonizing the city. Let's say all the strategies I've showed you in this kind of portraits of a small part of the Grand Genève are guided by this, and then they built, let's say, a landscape and a territory that is different from today. Nevertheless, it will be different. And this is, to conclude, is a picture of the same movie you saw at the beginning, is Jonas, that will be 25 in the year 2000, a very important movie of the 70s by Alain Tanner, where in fact in that moment of transition, because that was already a moment of transition and of crisis, industrial crisis, social crisis, we're restarting from re-understanding the relation with the soil and rethinking the forms of labor. And many of the ideas we are discussing today, and this is a question for me, for the panel, and for the discussion, were already there 40 years ago. Why we have to implement them only today? Thank you.
Thanks a lot. We are completely running out of time. I very much really thank you for your beautiful contributions. And it shows us we have to continue that kind of conferences and we have to continue that kind of reunion because there is still so much knowledge to share with each other. I would like to welcome Paola. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for closing the screen. I would like to welcome you now, Andrea Börner, as a respondent to this last panel. She works at the University for Applied Arts here in Vienna for architecture theory and urban strategies. And Andrea, I would like to ask you, after those three contributions that we heard now, what is the Angewandte working on at the moment? So when it comes to the large scale of urban reuse, what can you tell us about your projects, your theoretical projects, and the status quo?
Thank you, Wojciech. Thank you also for inviting me. Thank you for these very diverse, three very dense contributions. With regard to the question you just put, Wojciech, of course I cannot speak for the entire Angewandte. I can only speak from what I work in your institute. Yeah, the Institute of Architecture and basically my view on things. And I must admit, I will try to focus on the three last speeches. But since I followed the entire symposium from the very beginning. I might tie back to this also because things popped up in my head recurrently. And I think my take would, since I'm not practicing in planning, so I'm very far away from the really technical implementation approach. But what I found very interesting is picking certain terms and notions from the last three presentations. It seems to me that suddenly, as opposed to the two panels before, suddenly issues that were already mentioned in the very first lecture that regard life and nature come back in the larger territories. So we heard about metabolism. That is another type of circularity that not only corresponds to the material flow. Then about life cycles, where interestingly life was assigned to the built environment itself, which I found very interesting in the last lecture from Paola, and also the question of how infrastructure could be shifted and restructured. And finally, I was very happy to hear about beauty also in the second lecture, because I think aesthetics is something that we should not forget, not so much only with regard to style or let's say something that only appears to the visual eye, but also as a kind of experience that we have. And what I'm working on in the classes that I teach and what I develop together with students, in a way, somewhat tries to tackle all these issues. But I try to not distinguish between different scale packages that can be worked through. But I'd rather try always to think about how certain aspects, or how we can think about certain moments or objects or stories that are able to tie together the different scales. Because of course, in circular strategies or in any kind of cyclical, let's say, concepts, the scales cannot be separated, but they always interconnect, and things travel between them. So I was maybe I can just, and I don't know if this is a respondence now to the last panel, but maybe one thought that keeps coming back. I was wondering what, if we would reduce, let's say, if we would take two elements that are important in the whole system systems that we were talking about at the moment, that maybe not so much come from the built environment itself, but are fundamental to it. And the most largest one that I can think of that was addressed today in the very beginning is water, which is the basis for life, right? Which is also a very big part in all this recycling and reuse, let's say, processes that it was not explicitly mentioned, but it is part of it. And the other one, and I must say, I feel very much uncomfortable to addressing it, but maybe that's the way to tie back human, let's say, the human way of building their environment to a very fundamental way of how we connect to nature. And this is the only product that we actually bodily produce, which is still organic and does not belong to the unorganic matter. So that what leaves our digestive system. So if we look at the toilet and the way it is impacting how cities and architecture is being built around it for a very, very basic need that we have, it also includes an aesthetic experience that is basically not connected to beauty but disgust. So this is the very first moment where we say it's a kind of waste that we don't want to see, that we want to get rid of, and we use a tremendous amount of water in order to bring it far away. So I'm just wondering, tying it back to the territorial question and maybe also to the others, is there something, if the infrastructure, it's just one example, and I don't think that with the toilet we can find any solutions, but if the infrastructure with the water closet that is being installed all over the place, although at a certain moment in history there was a possibility that the composite, the dry toilet also wins over the system, but at that time, technologically wise, it was not really the best practice, obviously. Is there something, and I might add a word, that we can also repair trajectories that we have taken and that now produced a heavy amount of infrastructure? I'm not sure if this is an engineering question or an architectural question, but since it obviously does address aesthetic experiences also, I think architects might step out of, let's say, the traditional ways of thinking in certain scales where things can be applied, and maybe try to imagine, I mean, we do this anyways, but this would be my focus of understanding.
It all sounds like a perfect summary of the whole conference today. So thank you for your comment and your respondents to the small, medium, and large scale. And also thank you for this big spectrum that you were just drawing between beauty and non-beauty. We have one question from, let me just check, just a second, from Frank Ling, who would like to ask the panel, how can we deal with that, and how can we work with that when we've faced the fact that the single dominating force today in urban planning is financial business and is property development. So throughout the history, when we look at it, building cities, many times what was also showing power. It was getting together, it was sharing resources, but today very much it's financial power. So how can we take the financial power, how can we take economics into us and embrace them in order to find a good way to reuse urban spaces and urban resources? Who would like to give an answer to Frank Ling? Paola, Sergio, Helmut?
I can start. Of course, this is a very difficult question, but also working on this vision for the Greater Geneva, it's evident that in the actual conditions there is no transition possible. It's simply not possible. So in our ideas,
what has to happen in order to make it possible?
Well, let me conclude. In our proposal, we state this very clearly. In the actual conditions, there will not be the decrease of the CO2 emission. There will not be what we think should be done. So we propose to have, as in the past, there was the idea of special zones when there were very imbalanced situations, when inside, let's say, the market conditions, there was not a solution. What we have done in general in the different territories, we have created special zones. So in my opinion, because we cannot probably imagine that immediately there will be the total refuse of the actual organization, and in any case, this will bring some time to happen. We thought, and that was one of the image I was going through very, very quickly, but there is the idea of working on this weak structure. So if let's say, the infrastructure related to public transport is the more traditional hard structure, then we worked a lot on this idea of weak structure. This weak structure is made with what is today weaker.
Okay. Sorry for interrupting. I really have to keep that in mind. It's not a prolongation now of the lecture, but
okay. But
a very simple question by Frank Ling, and a very important question: how to deal with economical power today in urban cities and in urban planning? This is something that we have to take into our consideration. So
I'm telling you concretely how an architect, an urban designer is dealing with that concretely. Not theoretically, concretely. So what I'm saying is that our projects, they are elements of clarification and of, they address concretely these questions. In some cases, you have to arrive to the point of suggesting to create for the transition, to show the transition, to explore and to test the transition, you need to have a specific spaces. So let's imagine to work with these spaces. I call it spatial zone to make it simple, where you can test all the strategies related to circularity and in general the transition.
Okay, thank you. Sergio, I would like to address this question also to you, because one point of your lecture where I really kind of got shocked was when I realized what you said, that most of the cities that we consider beautiful today were never planned. They just happened. They were just growing. So when we take this aspect into consideration of beauty that was never planned and economic power that is planning today, how can we combine that? Does it go together?
It is as a matter of fact, it's always been a bit of blending of planning and not planning all the times. In the most beautiful parts of Florence, for example, originated when convents in the outskirts of the old city started to sell the land when the reurbanization happened and after the Middle Age. Okay, so they started to sell the land. They didn't sell the land to association of foundation for the beauty in cities. They sold the land to people who wanted to make money and to have the largest profit they could. And yet, and there were plans, and those plans were plans of streets and plots, and basically with a few half-page of regulations, more or less what we see now, and as we recover certain practices of the past, if you like, which actually look at the future, and in what we call the plot passport mechanisms of developing the land and regulating the land, a new system, new design code system, which are applied to actually plan less but plan better, Anyway, what I wanted to say regarding these financial constraints, I think that it is linked with what I was saying now. It's always been, beauty has always emerged with the interest which are linked to the developing of the land. What is going on now is that certain patterns which have always been there have been escalated up in terms of the scale, the centralization of the decision-making and the ownership of the land, for example. In the UK, we have the 7th largest developers who control more than half of what is built in the whole of the UK every year. So the system is incredibly coarse. Okay, what we have lost are the small and medium enterprises. We have lost the granularity. Mm-hmm. And this loss of granularity goes across the financial system and also goes across the spatial system of the cities. The enormous jump in scale in the units of developments in after Second World War is enormous, mm-hmm. and goes together with. Sorry, I'm taking too much time as usual. You go ahead.
I'm the one who's taking care of the time now. So
too late.
You mentioned 70% of UK economic. So this shows us exactly where to step in within the next years and where we have to find partners when it comes to circular strategies. One short question also to Helmut.
So I just add one thing, if you don't mind. It's not just about urban planning. It's about food. It's about culture. It's about identity.
Very shortly.
So, same system, same patterns going across various systems, not just cities.
Thank you. Helmut, one thing that you said and that I wrote down because it was also very shocking to me is that building and streets and everything which is man-made today in the world already has as much mass as all plants together.
On land.
On land. This, for me, it's a shocking number to hear that. Is this still a balance that is healthy and good and clever for us, or is this already completely overshoot?
Yeah. Well, the question is how you would measure a balance between these two things. But perhaps let me try it to answer it in a different manner. You have had this question about economics, and most people today think of economics as money flows, right? Interest rates, profits, and it's all measured in money. But I think I was talking about economics in a very different perspective. I was talking about economics from a biophysical perspective. And perhaps trying to link back to Sergio, I think most, if not all of the examples of beautiful structures you have shown were probably from pre-industrial or at least early industrial times. Yeah. And the structures we are building now, and they were built at a time when fossil fuel was not used at all, or perhaps at a very small rate. and it's perhaps it's not by chance that we find these structures very beautiful because they're so organic. Yeah, it's, by the way, the same for landscapes. If you show people landscapes and ask them whether they think they're beautiful, then people like landscapes that are more or less pre-industrial landscapes, where the structures are from a pre-industrial time, where you have a mixture of elements on small scales, yeah, where you have cropland, grassland, settlement, forest, all mixed up in small scales, which you only have, which is the optimal structure only in pre-fossil fuel times, yeah. Basically, the challenge of climate change is we have to get rid of these fossil fuels. And the message I was trying to convey, and I'm not sure whether I was successful, because it's a big gap between the communities I usually discuss with and this community here. And if I've not been successful, please forgive me. It's also very unusual for me to talk to this. But the main message here is that the energy systems societies have are inscribed in the structures they create. And if we want to get rid of the fossil fuel system, we will end up with very different structures. Yeah? Whether we find them beautiful or not, I don't know, but they will be very different from the structures we have today, which also means we will have very different organization of our economies.
Thank you. So these are important tasks for the future. Andrea, you told us that when we talk about circular strategies, not to include only the, if I may say so, the beautiful parts in our life, but also the parts of disgust, because this is also part of a circularity. So thank you very much for that input. And Paola, with your project, especially in Geneva, you showed us how important it is to combine all scales together. So you were talking about the small scale, the plots, the building itself, the soil, but you were also talking about the network and about the very large scale when it comes to mobility, and you have to cross borders. In your case, between Switzerland and France, and I think in our case, borders between different disciplines, between different opinions and different values that we share. So thank you very much for these beautiful contributions. And the lectures, I heard, Sergio, by you and also by others, you will share them with us, the presentation, so thank you for that. So there will be a very good documentation of that conference. Thank you very much for joining us. And my brain is like almost exploding. We heard many things today on different scales. And with this, I would like to give the last word to Karin, who was one of the organizers and the conceptual designers of this conference. I think, Karin, small scale, medium scale, and large scale, if I look back to the last 8 hours, I think that was quite a successful journey. What do you think?
Yeah, thank you very much, Wojciech. Yes, I also think so. So our concept to bring together very controversial approaches, I think, was interesting and had the desired result. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope that you have gained insights that are interesting theoretically and also interesting for your practice. And we will have another symposium next year, roughly at the same time. So if it was interesting for you, so please join us again. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you to you, and thank you to all speakers. So in this case, Karin, thank you also for hosting and for inviting me to facilitate today's conference. Have a good evening and see you next year, either here, Zoom, or hybrid, or in real. Thank you. Good night.